Hey everyone! Today we're talking about one of the longest and toughest battles in history, the Siege of Leningrad. This was a fight for survival, a test of endurance, and a powerful symbol of Soviet resistance against the Nazis during World War II. It all started in 1941, when Adolf Hitler launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union, called Operation Barbarossa. He believed that if he could capture Moscow and Leningrad, the USSR would collapse. Leningrad, which is now called Saint Petersburg, was an important city because it had factories and the Soviet Baltic Fleet. But instead of a quick victory, the Germans ended up in a brutal struggle that lasted more than 2 years. Hitler's plan wasn't just to take over Leningrad. He wanted to trap the people inside and starve them into surrendering. The city, home to about 2.5 million people, was completely surrounded by German and Finnish forces. The Nazis bombed supply routes and blocked food from getting in. But the people of Leningrad refused to give up. Even though they faced freezing winters, constant attacks, and extreme hunger, they kept fighting. With all the roads cut off, the only way to get food and supplies into the city was across the frozen Lake Ladoga in winter, or by boat in summer. This dangerous path was called the Road of Life, and it helped the city hold on. Meanwhile, the Soviet Red Army fought back, especially in the harsh winters, slowly weakening the German forces. After an incredible 872 days, the siege was finally broken in January 1944. The cost of survival was heartbreaking. More than 1 million civilians died, most from starvation. The suffering was unimaginable, but the people of Leningrad never lost hope. Their courage became a symbol of strength and determination. Before the siege even started, Hitler was sure he would win. After quickly defeating parts of Europe, he thought taking over the Soviet Union would be easy. His plan, Operation Barbarossa, involved a huge invasion force made up of German, Slovakian, Italian, Romanian, and Finnish troops. The Nazis used blitzkrieg tactics, which were fast and powerful attacks that had worked before. But Leningrad was different. The swampy land around the city made it hard to carry out these quick attacks, and the Soviet defenders fought back with everything they had. Leningrad was no ordinary city. It was founded in 1703, and had once been the capital of Russia. It produced about 10% of the Soviet Union's entire industrial output, making it a key target for the Nazis. Hitler believed that if Leningrad and Moscow fell, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin would have no choice but to surrender. Finnish troops, led by Marshal Karl Mannerheim, also advanced from the north, making it even harder for the city to hold out. As the Germans got closer, there wasn't much time for people to escape. Some valuable art pieces from the Hermitage Museum were secretly taken out, but most people had no way to leave. The Soviet forces in the city were led by different commanders over time. The first leader, Marshal Kliment Voroshilov, wasn't very effective, so he was replaced. Under generals like Georgy Zhukov, the defenders stood their ground, even as food supplies ran dangerously low. Anyone who abandoned their post without permission was executed. The Soviet Baltic Fleet also played a big role in defending Leningrad. German planes dropped thousands of mines in the harbor to trap the ships, but the fleet still used its powerful naval guns to fight back. Anti-aircraft weapons helped protect the city from air attacks. On Lake Ladoga, Soviet ships and barges became a lifeline, bringing in whatever supplies they could to help the starving people survive. And things in Leningrad were getting worse by the day. The first big hit came on July 8, when the German forces captured Schleswig, cutting off Leningrad's last land route to the east. Their goal was to completely surround the city, but something unexpected happened. The Finnish army refused to move past the river Svir. Finland had its own priorities and wasn't willing to go beyond the land it had lost to the Soviets in 1939. This decision left them about 26 miles away from Leningrad, but they still managed to block off the northern route, tightening the city's isolation. Meanwhile, the German army group north pushed south, aiming to sever the crucial Leningrad-Moscow railway. To make sure the blockade was complete, General Wilhelm von Lieb had to be strategic about positioning his troops. He set up two major fronts, one near the uranium bomb forts, and another just close enough to fire artillery into the city. The shelling began on September 4th, but because the Germans were short on ammunition, they couldn't keep up a constant barrage. Still, no part of Leningrad was safe. A few days later, German bombers joined in, launching repeated airstrikes. By September 8th, the Germans had taken control of the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, a spot Lieb called the bottleneck. Hitler wasn't satisfied though. He ordered Lieb to close the remaining gaps and cut the city off completely. In mid-October, German troops moved east to try and surround Leningrad entirely. The battle was fierce, and on November 8, they captured Tikhvin, an important railway hub. But just when it seemed like the Soviets were running out of options, Red Army reinforcements launched a counterattack. The Germans were already struggling with low supplies, and with the brutal Russian winter setting in, things only got harder for them. On December 8, Lieb had no choice but to retreat west of the Volkhov River. This was a huge break for Leningrad. It meant they could still get supplies from the east across Lake Ladoga. Hitler's plan to capture Leningrad in just a few weeks had completely fallen apart. Lieb simply didn't have enough soldiers to pull off such a massive encirclement, and things got even worse when Hitler decided to redirect tanks and most of the Air Force to Moscow. As if that wasn't enough, the winter was arriving earlier and colder than usual. By September 1941, Hitler had given up on taking Leningrad by force. Instead, he decided to destroy it completely. He issued an order stating that the city and its people should be wiped out through bombing, starvation, and disease. Even if the Soviets tried to surrender, the Germans were forbidden from accepting it. With that, the battle became a brutal siege, with both sides digging in for the long haul. Trenches, barbed wire, and landmines turned Leningrad into a frozen war zone. Because of the swampy terrain, tanks weren't much use, so both sides relied mostly on infantry, resulting in small, bloody battles. As the Axis forces tightened their grip, the people inside Leningrad were suffering terribly. Constant shelling, food shortages, and freezing temperatures made daily life unbearable. By November, rations were cut to nearly starvation levels. There was barely any fuel, meaning no heat for the long, harsh winter. The only way supplies could get in was through Lake Ladoga, by boat in summer, and by truck over the ice in winter. But even this was dangerous, as German bombers and artillery constantly attacked the route. Soviet anti-aircraft defenses improved in 1942, offering some protection, but even then, only about two-thirds of the city's daily food needs could be met. Hunger was everywhere, and even Red Army soldiers at the front lines were barely getting enough to survive. Some were given just 500 grams of food per day. Evacuations were possible, but not enough people got out. Trucks and boats bringing in supplies would take civilians with them on the way back. Eventually, around 850,000 people were evacuated this way. But more could have escaped if Leningrad's Communist Party leader, Andrei Zhdanov, hadn't been afraid of what Stalin might think. He worried that Stalin would see mass evacuations as a sign of weakness and punish him, as he had done with others before. Despite everything, the people of Leningrad did whatever they could to keep life going. Fuel and electricity were piped into the city through cables laid on the bottom of Lake Ladoga, but most civilians still had no heat or light during the first winter. By late summer, the Germans even sent boats and submarines to attack the lake's supply routes, making things even worse. Relief finally came when the Soviets managed to secure a narrow land corridor along the lake's southern shore, and build a railway link to the city. Even in the darkest moments, Leningrad's people refused to lose hope. Dmitri Shostakovich, a famous Russian composer who had been in the city during the siege, had volunteered as a firefighter before being evacuated. His Seventh Symphony, later called the Leningrad Symphony, became a powerful symbol of the city's resistance. The musical score was airdropped into the city, allowing the remaining members of Leningrad's orchestra to perform it. The sound of the symphony was broadcast through loudspeakers across the city, giving people a rare moment of inspiration and unity. It wasn't just music. Leningraders clung to any sense of normal life they could. Public libraries stayed open and were full of people trying to escape their grim reality through books. In the face of starvation, bombings, and unimaginable hardship, the people of Leningrad stood strong, determined not to let the enemy break them. As 1942 began, Leningrad was still fighting to survive, but the situation was terrible. Every day, about 4,000 people died, mostly from starvation and the freezing cold. In January, the Soviet Union launched an attack to break the siege. Their goal was to push through the German and Finnish positions between Lake Ladoga and Lake Yaman, opening a new battlefront called the Volkhov Front. Marshal Kirill Meretskov led the attack, sending a large force under General Andrei Vlasov deep into enemy territory. The Soviet troops had some advantages. They were well trained for extreme winter battles and used experimental sleds powered by aircraft engines to move quickly over the ice. At first, they made good progress, but by spring, the Germans had reinforced their defenses and launched a counterattack. Vlasov and his soldiers soon found themselves trapped. Stalin refused to allow them to retreat, sealing their fate. By June and July, Vlasov was captured, and his army was wiped out. 130,000 Soviet soldiers were either killed or taken prisoner. The Germans also suffered heavy losses, losing about 60,000 men. After that, Meretskov focused on keeping supply routes open, knowing that the people inside Leningrad were still in grave danger. In late August, the Germans launched another major attack. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, known for breaking stalemates on the Eastern Front, led the charge. His forces got closer to Leningrad than ever before, but the city's defenders were ready. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, men, women, and even children, had spent months digging trenches, setting up defenses, and building bunkers. By the time Manstein's forces arrived, Leningrad was surrounded by 550 miles of anti-tank ditches and 5,000 earth fortifications. The city's factories, back in operation thanks to restored electricity, continued producing weapons, sometimes sending tanks straight to battle without camouflage paint. Meanwhile, civilians planted crops wherever they could, hoping to grow enough food for the next winter. Just in case the Germans broke through, many buildings were rigged with explosives to prevent them from being used by the enemy. But in September 1942, the siege took another turn. Hitler decided that attacking Leningrad head-on was too costly and changed his strategy. Instead of fighting their way in, the Germans would try to starve the city into surrender. He ordered Army Group North's new commander, Georg von Kuchler, to block all supplies. Hitler wanted Leningrad wiped off the map, and if its people starved, he didn't care. By January 1943, the Soviet commanders had regrouped. Marshal Zhukov returned with a new plan: Operation Spark. The goal was to break the blockade by attacking south of Lake Ladoga. At the same time, General Govorov's forces hit the German-held bottleneck from the other side. The battles were brutal, but once again, when spring arrived, the Germans held their ground with fresh reinforcements. The stalemate continued. By September, the Germans had even managed to trap 2 Soviet armies. However, as the war shifted elsewhere, Hitler pulled more troops from Leningrad to fight on other fronts. This gave the Soviets some breathing room. Supplies were now reaching the city more reliably, and while conditions were still harsh, Leningrad was no longer completely cut off. By January 1944, the situation had completely changed. The Red Army now had twice as many soldiers as the Germans, and 4 times the number of tanks and aircraft. Their new offensive hit the Germans hard, forcing them to retreat. After years of fighting, the Axis forces were exhausted. They had suffered massive losses, and many of their best troops had been sent elsewhere. Hitler, refusing to admit defeat, ordered them to hold their ground at all costs. But on January 27, the remaining German forces ignored his orders and withdrew. The Siege of Leningrad was finally over. The cost was unimaginable. Around 1 million civilians had died, mostly from starvation and disease. The Red Army had lost 620,000 soldiers defending the city. But despite everything, Leningrad had survived. For Hitler, Operation Barbarossa had completely failed. The Soviet Union hadn't collapsed. It had fought back harder than anyone expected. The German army suffered huge losses that it could never recover from. Leningrad became a symbol of Soviet strength, proving that the war on the Eastern Front would be long and brutal, a war Hitler could never win. By May 1945, the Red Army reached Berlin, and Nazi Germany was defeated. The Eastern Front had been the deadliest battleground of World War II, but Leningrad endured.